Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday. I'm starting a new series on the post-exilic period. This is the American religious landscape. And what you might notice if you look at all these lines and dots is that no religion, according to this chart, according to the general survey that's been done since 1972 and before, no religion is now the largest, quote-unquote, religious group in America. Slightly more of them than evangelicals. Catholics are a bit below, and of course, you can see the main line's been just cratering. Black Protestants kind of stayed about the same. Other faiths, they've just kind of stayed about the same, grown a little bit, probably through immigration, and Jewish has sort of stayed about the same. So this, the nuns, as they're called, N-O-N-E-S, have gathered a lot of attention. And actually next week, I'll be talking to Nathan Jacobs, who made a movie, Becoming Truly Human, where he interviews the nuns and asks them questions about who they are and what they believe. And most of them have walked away from Christianity in one form or another. And then why did they walk away? Well, in a lot of ways, a lot of them will just basically say, well, it didn't work. What does that mean? Well, their faith was too simplistic, or the religious answers they were given were too simplistic, or it's just not believable or viable. And some will basically make statements that boil down to something like it didn't match their moral matrix. But they don't become. It's always Fridays that the Windows wants to update itself. But they don't really become atheists. That much is pretty clear. They continue to believe in lots of spiritual things. They continue to believe in karma. They're often anxious about life after death because they believe that something will come after death, and they're not quite sure. They're not quite sure it'll be good. And they often get very spiritual. And what I mean by that is they tend to negotiate with the universe, and they tend to get ideas about what moves us. And one of my stock examples of this is Verizon Lisa. In a Verizon commercial a number of years ago, you have Lisa talking not to God, not to some God, but to the universe. And I find this very often. People they don't believe in God anymore, but they'll talk to the universe plenty, and they'll attribute things to the universe. Well, the universe is bringing me this, and the universe is bringing me that. And they have all kinds of things like the law of attraction that, or karma. If they do good things will happen. My Name is Earl was a show that was on TV. And Verizon Lisa says in this commercial, it's almost like the universe is telling me to buy a smartphone. So people don't know usually what they mean when they say spiritual, as in spiritual but not religious, but it's something like that thing that moves me that I don't really know what it is, and I don't understand what it is, and it sort of comes from inside of me somehow, or comes from outside of me somehow. It's the thing that makes things move. It's the things that moves me or motivates me. That's sort of spirit or spiritual. Now, given enough time, most of these folks will reinvent nearly every religious or spiritual idea that has been under the sun. And what's usually more dramatic is they think that they thought of it first, or that it's new for them, or that it's a new thing. But if you actually sort of keep watch on spiritual matters and what people come up with, you'll notice that just as the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, last week we talked about Cyrus, the anointed of the Lord, and it was pretty dramatic that the book of Isaiah would talk about him in such terms. He was a very spiritual guy. In fact, he let 1,000 religious flowers bloom all over his new empire. He basically understood that, well, if you want to make people happy, give them religion, because one way or another, people like religion. In fact, they'll ditch their old religion and they'll make up a new one. That's sort of what we do. And so contemporary views of Cyrus tend to be that he was an enlightened despot. Cyrus was an enlightened and tolerant king. After his seizure of Babylon, he released an edict in which he promised displaced peoples a return to their countries and a right to rebuild the sanctuaries of their gods. This was quite an opposite policy to which was followed by the Babylonians, who tended to bring everyone in and convert them to their own religion. At the same time, it was a realistic policy that would create the maximum amount of contentment among the peoples under the jurisdiction of the Persians. This created an excellent occasion for the exiled Jews in Babylon to return to Judah and rebuild the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. This opportunity was taken up by Sheshbazzar and certain Jews. Now, how did religion function in the lives of ancient people? Well, not really that different from how it functions in people's lives today. It gave them identity. It helped them know who they were. Actually, before the rise of the nation states, which have sort of become quasi-religious, patriotism can sort of take on the role of religion often. We believe in America rather than believing in Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or what have you. But the relational machinery of religion was there to move the gods so that the people could get what they wanted. And so that's why every nation had temples and priests and sacrifices and all this sort of things, because the world, in fact, depended upon it for food production, for fertility, for defense against enemies. Gods were sort of like superheroes. Now, they could be fickle and relationally or religiously needy, but that's sort of what the gods were. Now, Israel was a lot like many of the other nations in many other ways, but there's one aspect in which they were quite distinct. And John Walton did an interesting study of ancient Near East oracles versus Israelite oracles. And what he found out was that in many cases, and actually this persists on through the Roman period because Augustine will deal with it in his book, The City of God, what most of the other oracles and prophets of other religions really told the people and exhorted the people to do was, come to the temple, make your sacrifices. If you don't do this, then the gods will be angry. And you can find this all the way over in Mesoamerica. That the price of not keeping your religious vows was disaster. But once you paid your religious penalty, once you paid your religious taxation, well, you could pretty much live as you wanted. Well, the Israelites really weren't that way, because whereas they certainly had obligations to the temple in Jerusalem and to the religious practices of their people, they had this covenant, and they're supposed to keep this covenant. And this covenant, in fact, had a great deal to say about how they treated their neighbors and how they treated each other, how they would treat their slaves, how they would treat others in their community. It seems that the God of Israel cared not just about getting his piece of change, but about how exactly his people, the people who bore his name, lived in their day-to-day lives in terms of their politics, their economics, their relationships with one another. This God seemed to care about all those things, and Israelite oracles dealt with those kinds of things. Now, so some of the Jews from Babylon returned, but a significant group stayed behind because they had become prosperous and were satisfied with the conditions of that country. They had enjoyed a great amount of freedom, and some of them concentrated on success in business. This is from the same commentary that I read from earlier. More than a century later, they invented what was in fact the first banking house in human history. And although many were financially rich, they helped the returnees get back. And you might ask, why did they help them? You might really ask the question, why was it so important to the wealthy Jews who stayed out in the Persian Empire, in fact, who had spread over into the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire? In fact, Judea remained a very poor place. And many of the children of Israel would stay intermingled out amongst the nations in various places. Why was it so important to send a group of people back to build the temple? Well, might not we imagine that the same religious impulse that moved all those other people moved them as well? And in fact, they return in waves, and you can see that. Well, if you read the book of Esther, all the stuff going on with Esther, all of that's going on at the same time that people are moving back to Jerusalem and working to rebuild the temple and working to rebuild the walls. All that's found in these books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which in fact were one book. And the book begins with King Cyrus in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus. You see, again, here God is moving even the hearts of pagan kings. The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to also put it into writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, said. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all kingdoms on earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of God, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may be God with and may their God be with them. And Cyrus is probably also thinking, and also with me. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold and goods and livestock, with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. This was Cyrus's strategy, which was different from those of the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, these are the people from the southern kingdom of Judah who were taken, the family heads and the priests and the Levites, of course, they were especially important in this plan, and everyone whose heart God had moved, so people freely chose, prepared to go back to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. This was the temple as religious technology. The people themselves would flourish. And so the plates and things that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen and that were still in Babylon were all sent back. And in fact, the book has a list of them. And they very much, and then they were very careful about how to do this, because they knew that, well, their failures in the past had caused the devastating exile and destruction. So they searched through family records, and so a group of people wanted to be priests, and they couldn't find them. So they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. And the governor ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred food until there was a priest ministering with the Urim and Thummim. They were there to reestablish the religious and spiritual technology of God's people for the flourishing of Cyrus and the Jews all over the diaspora. And they even have a little list of who went. The whole company numbered 42,360. Besides them were 7,337 male and female slaves. That's about one slave for every 6 free Hebrews. And there were also 200 male and female singers. And there were 736 horses. Horses were important, powerful animals that the wealthy would have. Donkeys were much more traditional for Judah. And so there were many more of them, but these were middle-class people, and they were going down there with a mission. They were probably, at the upper end of the religiously motivated spectrum in terms of their people. They were probably middle-class, and they were being supported by money both sent by the empire and sent by their more prosperous friends who were still living in the diaspora. And they came down with money to invest. And so they put money into their resettlement, and they resettled towns all over the place. And they had money that was going to be dedicated for the work of building up the temple. And they didn't go back to the old high place system like before Solomon's temple. They were going to once again build an altar to God on the proper mountain where they would do the sacrifices as the law of Moses, the man of God, had shown. They were going to do their religious technology right, and things were supposed to fall into place. Despite the fear of the peoples around them. What? The land isn't empty? No, the land isn't empty. So the people returning started back with their morning and evening sacrifices, and then the festival of tabernacles and the new moon sacrifices and the appointed sacred festivals, and they had on the first day of the 7th month they began to burn burnt offerings to the Lord. Though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid, they've got to get the machinery moving. But what's with these other people? Well, when Nebuchadnezzar came down, he took the elite, the rulers, the educated, the artisans, the people who would be seen by the Babylonians to be of value. And what was left behind was a people who disagreed about how things should go. And they had a lot of strife. Should they get along with Babylon, or should they side with Egypt that Babylon had not conquered and play one against the other? That usually Israel in this area was sort of a buffer state between these major imperial areas, and the way they, like many small nations of the world, especially during the Cold War when there were two primary powers, you always play one off against the other. And so now all these important people, the returnees, start returning, and they're coming down with their money. But what about the people who had been left behind? Well, they scraped out an existence. They didn't rebuild the altar or the temple or do any of these things. They were probably the least educated, and they mingled probably when the land was evacuated. Other people start moving in, and then they intermarry. This is 50 years later. And the people who were there probably moved into the homes of the wealthy elite and artisan people who left. And so now people come back and they want their old homes again. And, well, you can see some of these kind of things play out even in the Palestinian issues of 1947. That was a much longer period of time. But, people move on with their lives, and who are these people? And they're coming down, and they're taking control, and they're taking control of the city again, and now they want to be in charge again, and they're coming down with money, and well, one of the things that you're going to notice is that they don't get along. So the returnees begin to do their work on the temple, and again, they're following all the rules. This is technology at stake here. We've got to do this right. And if we do this right, then God is going to work and everything will be as it should. And they laid the foundations with praise. Mission accomplished. But also with mourning. Many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of the temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sounds of joy from the sounds of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. Now, one of the most striking things about these books, Ezra and Nehemiah, are just how honest they are. Because it would be very easy to sort of write propaganda about everything that was going on. Propaganda either from the ideas of the people returning, or propaganda from the ideas of the people who were there to somehow tell a good story that would be used as propaganda for making sure that everybody falls in line with the technology we need to make God work. But they don't. In fact, part of the reason I think so many Christians never read these books is because they're depressing. They come down and they're thinking of all of these prophecies of when they return, things will be wonderful, things will be grand, and then they return and it's just a slog, and it's a fight, and people don't get along, and they're angry with each other, and they have a degree of freedom, but they're dependent on the wealthy people back in other parts of the Persian Empire, and it's not at all what they thought would happen. If you want to see a nice overview of these two books, the Bible Project just does a wonderful job, and it's a 12, 15-minute video or so, and it'll go through the main outlines of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and you can see the tension between the peoples. In fact, this tension between the peoples will be there all along, and it isn't going away, and you don't have the wonderful fulfillment that everyone imagined, that the prophet said would happen. It doesn't happen. And what are they supposed to do with that? You see, we never fully escape our instrumental relationship with God. We want religion to be technology to help us get what we want. This is so deeply baked in us as human beings that even after people decide they're going to give up on religion, they make a whole new one themselves. The more desperate we feel, which is usually a matter of perception, we may or may not be desperate in the eyes of others, the more tempted we are to use God and other people to get what we want. And we live in a remarkably stable and affluent age. So if nuns are becoming religious, well, of course these people will. A deep part of the project of God with Israel is breaking them of this instrumentality, of that transactional basis for religion that we find universal in the human heart. Now, isn't our relationship with God, or aren't our relationships often transactional or instrumental? And of course they are. We understand the transactional in many relationships, our commercial relationships, our cooperative relationships. I do my part, you do yours. We all work together, things will be good. And if you don't do your part, I'm not going to do my part. The problem with human beings is that we fail. And this often gets offensive in the most intimate relationships, because our most intimate relationships, there's always a sense of transactionality, but it can never be such fully. You see this with children and parents. If the child, let's say, is disabled, should the parents say, whoop, that's a lost cause, send him out to the glue factory? If your spouse gets sick, you say, gosh, my spouse is sick. I don't want to be with a sick person. Go, divorce them. Jesus comes down very hard on this kind of thing. And somehow we all know people shouldn't be used. People should be loved. And so we have this uneasy relationship with transactionality and instrumentality in relationships. But we imagine that that's how we should treat God. Now, the post-exilic story won't be much happier than before. In fact, it's pretty grim, which again is why hardly anybody reads it for devotions. The temple won't work like it's expected to. And this causes nothing but trouble and argument and angst. And this stuff goes on all the way up until, 500 years until we begin to see Jesus and what's going on there. It's the same stuff going on. All of the normal strife, success, division, loss that any of us encounter any day. Now, the story of the Bible is not that we should be transactional with one another and get on top. The story of the Bible is actually that God will act on our behalf, not because of our sacrifices, but because of himself. In Christ, the linkage imagined by the people is broken because the sin they commit for religious reasons, which is killing Jesus, will become the method by which God brings them redemption. That's the strangest twist in all of human history, that they kill the Son of God out of religious zealotry and out of political jealousy and out of a half a dozen other reasons, because we're always filled with all kinds of motivations. But God uses this to save them, to give them redemption, to forgive their sins, to start a new world. So how should we respond? Should we then become non-religious? Well, I don't think you're going to be able to. Giving up religion won't make you less selfish. And you won't actually be able to accomplish anything, because you'll probably just make up a new religion yourself. And this is why you might notice that all of my sermons have the structure of misery, deliverance, gratitude. Because our religiosity should actually be a response to grace. It doesn't prime the pump. It doesn't make God do things for us. May your religious impulse express gratitude rather than the normal transactional manipulation.